Welcome back to the War Room, where we are going to look at a small battle from the War of the Roses. The Battle of Ferrybridge was a precursor to the much more famous Battle of Towton, which gets a lot of interest as the largest and most costly battle ever fought on British soil. Ferrybridge was fought literally the day before, probably, and is overshadowed by the bigger battle, usually featuring as a minor skirmish or some scene setting before the main event. But digging into the details, I think it's a really interesting look at the level of sophistication of warfare in this period. First though, we need some background. The War of the Roses was a civil war that essentially came about through a combination of decentralised power and extended royal bloodlines. In theory, the country was an absolute monarchy ruled by King Henry VI. In practice, Henry simply didn't have the character or ability to control the competing nobles beneath him. This was exacerbated by Henry being plagued by crippling mental illness and effectively controlled by a court faction and his wife, the formidable Margaret of Anjou, whom he married in 1445. This proved unpopular, to say the least. Other noble houses, some of whom could also trace royal descent, were rich and powerful enough to contest the royal authority, leading to a growing coalescence of factions as lords aligned with the royal house of Lancaster under King Henry and the house of York under Richard, Duke of York. With the French steadily rolling up English territory across the Channel, growing corruption at court and spiralling financial problems, factional flashpoints began to escalate, greatly exacerbated by Henry suffering a mental breakdown after English defeat at Castellon in 1453. This brought events to a head, and York kicked off what would later be known as the Wars of the Roses by surprising the king's retinue at the Battle of St. Albans on the 22nd of May 1455. There, the Yorkists didn't only capture King Henry, but took the opportunity to eliminate the key Lancastrian lords who were present. This really set the tone for the ensuing war. It was a conflict between noble families over who got to rule England, in which the nobles themselves were critical pivot points. Political, military and economic power was wrapped up in individuals and their successors. The death of lords and their sons allowed victors to carve up their assets to retain personally or to distribute to loyal followers, whilst crippling the defeated. Earlier practices of ransoming captured nobles back to their families for a lump sum were replaced by executions, as both great and minor houses sought to cripple or wipe out their competition. At the same time, because the emphasis was on the nobility, both sides displayed a preference for pitched battles and rapid results. Armies of the time, especially large armies, could burn a trail of destruction through even friendly territory simply because they were difficult to supply and frequently had to resort to living off the land. The longer armies stayed in the field, the more disruption and damage they caused, and with both sides in the Civil War aiming to control the land they were fighting over, short, sharp campaigns with decisive results ensured that the victors didn't inherit a blasted wasteland. This hardly means that looting and pillaging didn't take place, but as a rule, it was more likely to be carried out by lower-level subordinate commanders pursuing personal feuds than it was as part of a coherent top-down strategy. In the first phase of the Wars of the Roses, the Yorkists were driven out of England, taking refuge in Ireland and English-controlled Calais. In the second phase, they returned and recaptured King Henry at the Battle of Northampton. This allowed the Yorkists to establish their claim to the throne by arranging the House of York to ascend after the death of Henry, but the Queen, Margaret of Anjou, had escaped and was able to build up support in the north. Richard of York and his son Edmund went north to deal with the resurgent Lancastrians, but were caught out at the Battle of Wakefield, where both Richard and Edmund were killed. By some accounts, Edmund was attempting to escape over Wakefield Bridge when he was caught and either killed or executed by Lord John Butcher Clifford. He was going to be commanding the Lancastrian force at the Battle of Ferrybridge. Clifford's father had been one of the Lancastrian lords killed at First St. Albans, firmly fixing him in the Lancastrian camp, and he was no doubt out for revenge. Edmund was 17. He had just fought in the Battle of Wakefield and was a legitimate combatant, not a murdered 12-year-old boy as he appears in Shakespeare, but his death at Clifford's hand really highlights the internecine nature of the conflict. With Richard of York's and Edmund's heads put on spikes atop Micklegate Bar in York, the Lancastrians pushed south and ran into the Earl of Warwick's Yorkists at St Albans. At this second Battle of St Albans, the Lancastrians were triumphant, recapturing Henry, who Warwick had been dragging around with him, and then, denied entry to the City of London, retreated back towards their power base in the north. Edward of York, Richard's remaining son, joined Warwick after a successful campaign in Wales, and together they pursued. Eventually, the Yorkist and Lancastrian armies would clash at Towton. The Yorkists would prevail, and Edward would be crowned Edward IV, ending the second phase of the War of the Roses. But before that we have our battle, the Battle of Ferrybridge. This is where things get interesting from both a military and historiographical perspective. Medieval sources are, as a rule, not great. Sources can be few and far between, contradictory, inaccurate, biased, or simply not intended to provide information that we might want. Even the ground has changed in the intervening 500 years. Rivers change course, roads fall out of use, settlements grow and shrink or disappear and spring up, woods can be cut down or planted, marshes can be drained or left to develop, even hills and slopes can be dramatically altered by both human activity and natural processes. So even something as physical as a battle site, assuming it can be accurately located, isn't necessarily going to help us understand what happened there in any detail. So from here on out, we really just have a skeleton of events, and we have to fill in the gaps with possibilities, summations, and military logic. That doesn't necessarily devalue the history. It simply places the emphasis on sensible interpretation. In other words, what I'm going to talk about from here on out is not necessarily accurate, but it should be interesting. We know that Edward and most of the Yorkist army probably arrived at Pontefract on the 27th of March. Only a few kilometres to the north is the River Aire. This constitutes a serious obstacle, crossed by the Old London Road at Ferrybridge and the Roman Ridge Road, which runs parallel about 5 kilometres to the west and crosses at Castleford. About 15 kilometres beyond Ferrybridge is the village of Towton, which is where the Yorkist and Lancastrians will ultimately clash on the 29th. Past Towton is the town of Tadcaster on the River Wharfe, and roughly another 15 kilometres to the northwest is the city of York. York is where the Lancastrians have been mustering their forces, and at some point, it's not clear exactly when, they leave the city, pass through Tadcaster and arrive at Towton, where they intend to give battle on the high ground in wide open fields with their flanks secured by the Cockbeck on one side and the Old London Road and some marshes on the other. On the same day the Yorkists arrive at Pontefract, they send out Lord Fitzwalter with a small force to seize the bridge over the Aire at Ferrybridge. The Lancastrians have broken the bridge in order to delay the Yorkists. It seems likely it wasn't completely destroyed though, because Fitzwalter crosses it, establishes a bridgehead on the far side, and then starts repairs. That doesn't seem that likely if the whole bridge would be demolished, and it doesn't tie into the desire of both sides to try and limit the disruption to economic activity. So the Lancastrians probably left the piles intact and took up most of the bridge service to leave only a narrow passage. It's still a significant obstacle, especially in tactical terms, but evidently not enough for any kind of outpost force the Lancastrians may have left there to stop Fitzwalter. Then, on the night of the 27th to 28th, Lord Clifford rides out from the Lancastrian army with a force of maybe 500 light cavalry, falls on Fitzwalter's bridgehead in a night attack and destroys it. Or, in the words of Hall, who is a contemporary chronicler, the Lord Clifford determined with his light horsemen to make essay to such as kept the passage of Ferrybridge, and so departed from the great army on the Saturday before Palm Sunday, and early all his enemies were ware, gat the bridge, and slew the keepers of the same, and all such as would withstand him. It does seem that Clifford caught the Yorkists by surprise. Hall also details how Fitzwalter bursts out of his tent with a poleaxe, thinking that his men are having a punch-up, and without his armour on, is quickly cut down before he figures out his camp is being overrun. This is really interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, by this time, English medieval armies predominantly fight on foot. This was certainly the case by the 100 Years' War. The famous English victories at Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt were won by a combination of archers and infantry, not by cavalry. The upcoming Battle of Towton will also be an almost entirely foot affair. But outside of major engagements, in the space between armies, we clearly have a zone where light cavalry has a role. Clifford's force is outright stated to be made up of light horsemen. It's named elsewhere as the Flower of Craven after one of Clifford's domains. Fitzwalter's force is referred to as four prickers, the pricks here referring to lances. So they're also likely a light cavalry force, performing a key reconnaissance and enabling function for the main body by going on ahead and securing a choke point. So we have the Yorkist army at Pontefract, the Lancastrians potentially at Towton, and both sides light cavalry running around in the middle doing light cavalry things. They are not necessarily fighting mounted. Neither Fitzwalter's initial seizure of the bridge or Clifford's recapture of it are particularly amenable to men on horseback, but they are definitely exploiting the mobility offered by the horse. Secondly, Clifford appears to mount a night attack. This is always risky. The natural chaos and confusion of battle is obviously magnified in the dark, but Clifford clearly considered that his force was capable of fighting at night. And this is entirely plausible. While a great many men who fought in the Wars of the Roses were mustered out of their day jobs to fight in specific campaigns, low-level warfare in France, on the border with Scotland, and between noble families was pretty much constant and had created a lot of highly experienced professional soldiers that lords like Clifford could maintain as retainers. Small-scale actions like raids, ambushes and patrols, day or night, were almost certainly bread and butter for dedicated light cavalry forces like Clifford's Flower of Craven. So Clifford rides down to Ferrybridge in the night, smashes Fitzwalter's men, and regains control of the crossing. Now, the Yorkists will have to fight to get across the River Aire before they can engage the main Lancastrian army to the north. But why has Clifford decided, or been ordered, to do this? It's hard to be sure. Hall says that the Lancastrian commanders intended to stop Edward from crossing the Aire, which implies that Towton was not the intended battlefield. But to my mind at least, that introduces a lot of uncertainty into the situation. There are very experienced professionals on both sides here. Are the Yorkists going to try and attack over a single bridge at Ferrybridge with the entire Lancastrian army waiting for them on the other side? I would guess not. In that situation, the Lancastrians would have such an obvious positional advantage that the Yorkists would likely decline the offer of battle. They don't have to fight just because the Lancastrians want them to, so the campaign could drag on as both sides attempt to maneuver the other into a position in which they either must fight or a position in which they think they have a good chance to prevail. That's certainly not impossible. And the Lancastrians may have wanted that kind of extended campaign if they considered that their supply lines back to York were more robust than what the Yorkists had available. Remember, it's March, it's cold, there's snow on the ground, Towton a couple of days later is fought in a blizzard. These are not healthy conditions for armies to be marching and counter-marching in for extended periods. It might be more likely, though, that the Lancastrians always intended to fight on the Old London Road at Towton, on a battlefield that they had selected themselves, in a position which the Yorkists would not see as too strong to engage, and where they could fight a single decisive battle. In that case, contesting the Aire crossing at Ferrybridge takes on very different characteristics. Instead of being the advance guard of an army that is on its way to support and reinforce it, Clifford's force is seeking to inflict delay and attrition on the enemy by exploiting the favourable tactical position of a choke point. The Yorkists might be mad to try and force their way across a narrow bridge in the face of 25,000 Lancastrians, but against the 500 men of the Flower of Craven, things are a bit different. Even though the tactical situation might favour the Lancastrians, it may well be worth tackling their positional advantage with mass in order to maintain the speed of the Yorkist advance north. In other words, Clifford might have made a conscious decision to throw his force into a position where the Yorkists are encouraged to attack him on terms where he can inflict disproportionate casualties, tire out and demoralise the Yorkist army prior to the big showdown at Towton. As a light cavalry force, the Flower of Craven can potentially hold the bridge until the last minute, then mount up and ride away before the Yorkists can bring up their own cavalry to mount an effective pursuit. To go along with these two potential reasons, we can throw in a question mark over the exact position of the Lancastrian army. This is mostly because I can't find an exact date for it arriving at Towton. It was certainly there on the 29th, and probably there before the evening of the 28th. But if we consider the possibility that the Lancastrian army was not in position when Clifford was dispatched, then the ensuing Battle of Ferrybridge takes on a very different character. If the Lancastrians were not already at or very close to Towton, then Fitzwalter's seizure of Ferrybridge opens the door for the Yorkists to rapidly advance up the Old London Road and beat the Lancastrians to their intended battlefield, at which point the certainty of a decisive engagement declines and the possibility of that protracted campaign in terrible weather looms. Under those circumstances, Clifford might have been sent out to delay the Yorkists long enough for the Lancastrian army to get into position. Whatever the reasoning behind it, on the morning of the 28th of March, Clifford is in control of the air crossing at Ferrybridge. In the morning, the Earl of Warwick comes up from Pontefract and runs into the Lancastrians either at or before the bridge. It's not clear whether Clifford has pushed pickets onto the southern bank. What is clear is that Clifford's force contains archers because Warwick is wounded in the leg by an arrow. Returning to Edward at Pontefract, Warwick relays the news that the Lancastrians hold Ferrybridge and the Yorkist army springs into action, marching up to storm the crossing. There is an alternate version of this relayed by the Burgundian Jean de Warenne, who, unlike Hall, was a professional soldier and might be more reliable on military matters, but he doesn't seem to mention Fitzwalter and the night attack. Nevertheless, de Warenne's account essentially describes an escalating battle as Yorkist scouts advance on the bridge, get into trouble, and have to be reinforced. Following this, in de Warenne's words, they managed to push the enemy back to the bridge where they formed a defensive line. When the Earl of March, that's Edward of York, heard about this, he ordered all his council and troops to move closer to the enemy, and after he had made a new camp, he went to see the situation with his commanders. After studying the enemy's positions, the courageous and pious Earl of March declared it was necessary to gain the passage rapidly, as they would not be able to press their advantage further otherwise. Therefore, the order was given to attack the bridge, which had been fortified by the enemy, and it so happened the battle lasted from midday to 6 o'clock in the evening, and there died more than 3,000 men on both sides. This corresponds somewhat with Hall's account of Warwick's scouting force running into Clifford and falling back on the main Yorkist force, which then moves up to attack. We can get another perspective on the fighting from George Neville, who is Warwick's brother and Bishop of Exeter, in some letters he wrote to the Bishop of Milan, saying, "Our adversaries had broken the bridge, which was our way across, and were strongly posted on the other side, so that our men could cross by a narrow way, which they had made themselves after the bridge was broken. But our men forced away by the sword, and many were slain on both sides. Finally, the enemy took to flight, and very many of them were slain as they fled." Now, as a committed Yorkist, George Neville might not be a tremendously reliable source, but putting all this together, we can safely say that a battle took place with Yorkist troops trying to force their way across the bridge in the face of a stiff defence by Clifford's Lancastrians. And attacking the bridge is an intimidating prospect. Depending on how broken it is, it might be an intimidating prospect even before we start factoring in the defenders. With nothing to hold onto and the potential for a wet or frozen bridge surface, anyone crossing might be a slip or a stumble away from falling in the river air. Wearing armour, that's probably a one-way trip, whether that armour is heavy metal or absorbent textile. And you're going to be wanting to wear armour because the Lancastrians are going to be firing arrows at you. Clifford's Flower of Craven might be described as light horse, but they almost certainly include some mounted archers, and it's not unreasonable to assume they follow the usual War of the Roses organisational practice of being very longbow heavy, especially if they're intending to do most of their fighting dismounted. so we can expect the attacking Yorkists to be coming under fire from longbows as they try to cross the bridge. And this fire was probably very effective. It could be applied at close range. As the Yorkists got closer, fire from up and down the bank could start to be hitting the more vulnerable flanks of armoured men. Casualties falling on the bridge would be a dangerous obstacle to the men following, assuming they didn't fall off into the river and drown. Armour at this time was probably very effective against arrow fire, that's why people wore it, but the kind of full plate harness that could offer maximum protection was too expensive to be worn by anyone except a minority of rich combatants. Even then, the quality would vary, men might choose not to wear all the components, and there were still weak points that lucky arrows or fragments and splinters from shattering arrows could find and penetrate. All this, and there's almost certainly a group of Clifford's men-at-arms and other troops equipped for close combat waiting at the far end of the bridge. Given the narrow funnel effect of the bridge, these may well have outnumbered the attacking Yorkists at the sharp end where it mattered. At a minimum, these troops would likely have fixed any attackers in position on the bridge as they tried to carve a way forward at a disadvantage, leaving the other members of the storming party trapped under arrow fire. The Yorkist solution for this was probably their own arrow fire. They will have had significantly more men than Clifford and a lot more longbowmen, so it follows that they would have tried to effectively suppress or drive away the Lancastrians on the north bank to give their men attacking over the bridge the space they needed to get across. This could well have been difficult though. Thinking in modern terms, the Lancastrians can mass their fire at a single point, the bridge, while remaining dispersed and mobile, taking advantage of any cover and concealment to minimise the effects of Yorkist archery, which needs to be diluted across a wider array of targets. We also need to take into account the possibility of fortifications. De Warenne indicates that the Lancastrians had fortified the bridge, whether that was before the Yorkists came north, or it was an exercise in improvisation using local materials and whatever Fitzwalter's men had been repairing the bridge with is unclear. It's also possible that there were some buildings there. It was a toll bridge, and the toll collectors manning it would probably have some kind of shelter. But we can say that any kind of barricade or constructed firing position, especially any positions able to cover the bridge in defilade from the far bank, would have greatly magnified the Lancastrians' tactical advantages here. It seems likely that there was a relatively constant state of both sides exchanging arrow fire across the river, punctuated by occasional bursts of activity as the Yorkists attempted to force storming parties across and secure a foothold. It doesn't take a military genius to realise that this is a situation that favours the defenders. At some point, potentially quite early on after Edward has come up and judged that a frontal attack isn't going to cut it, the Yorkists dispatch a light cavalry force under Lord Fauconberg to the west. About 5 kilometres away as the crow flies is Castleford, the other crossing point over the Aire. It's not clear whether this was also defended by the Lancastrians, whether Clifford had sent a detachment to cover it, or there was an existing outpost there, or indeed whether other Yorkist advance parties had already secured it. Whatever the details, Fauconberg gets across the river at Castleford, taking advantage of Clifford's exposed flank. In Hall's words again, the Lord Fauconberg, Sir William Blount and Robert Horne, with the forward, passed the river at Castleford, 3 miles from Ferrybridge, intending to have environed and enclose Lord Clifford and his company, but they being thereof advertised, departed in great haste towards King Henry's army. So Clifford learns that the Yorkist flanking force is bearing down on him, disengages from the fighting at Ferrybridge, and retreats north, probably up the Old London Road, falling back on the main Lancastrian army at Towton. But before Clifford and the Flower of Craven can make good their escape, they're caught in an ambush. According to Hall, they met with some that they looked not for, and were trapped before they were aware. For the Lord Clifford, either from heat or pain, put off his bever, that's a piece of armour that protects the throat, was suddenly hit with an arrow, as some say without a head, and was stricken in the throat, and incontinent rendered his spirit, and all his company almost was slain at a place called Dintingdale, not far from Towton. This is another interesting passage on a few counts, but it's obvious that we're back into this dynamic light cavalry arena between the two armies. either some Yorkists got onto Clifford's line of retreat and were able to catch him and his men out and destroy them, or Fauconberg either intercepted him or rode him down. How likely it is that there were Yorkists in position ahead of Clifford depends an awful lot on the exact timing of events, which we just don't know. We could well be dealing with Fauconberg's force, or elements of it, but an alternative might be that Yorkist light cavalry units have been operating on the northern bank for much longer. It's certainly not impossible that some scouts passed through Ferrybridge after Fitzwalter had secured it and before Clifford recaptured it, or that the crossing at Castleford had been in Yorkist hands for some time and light cavalry had already gotten onto the north bank. The possibility of other forces operating between Ferrybridge and Towton also means we have to consider whether there are other Lancastrian light cavalry units in the mix as well, and whether there is what we would today call a reconnaissance battle going on behind Clifford while he holds the main Yorkist force off at Ferrybridge. And again, that gets into questions of how far away the Lancastrians are from Towton on the 28th. If they're still coming up as Clifford is retreating, then it could be quite plausible that the Yorkists are on top in the reconnaissance battle. There's certainly no mention of Clifford getting any support, and Dintingdale is only a couple of kilometres away from Towton. It seems very strange that Yorkist forces might be able to ambush and destroy whatever was left of the Flower of Craven so close to the position of the main Lancastrian army. I think it's reasonable to suggest that that army would have had its pickets out and that it would be aiming to contest the presence of Yorkist parties that got too close. There are some suggestions that Clifford was hung out to dry by the other Lancastrian commanders. I think it's much more likely that they simply weren't in position to help out. Regardless of the exact circumstances of Clifford's death, he was killed at Dintingdale, along with most of the surviving Flower of Craven. In the aftermath of the Battle of Ferrybridge, the Yorkists repair the bridge and cross the River Aire. On the next day, the Lancastrians and Yorkists will clash at Towton, with the Yorkists eventually prevailing in a bloody victory. That's inevitably a more important battle than Ferrybridge, which is a mere scene-setting skirmish by comparison, and to some extent the significance of Clifford's actions and the Yorkist response is wrapped up in the overall situation between the two armies. If the Battle of Ferrybridge delayed the Yorkists long enough for the Lancastrian army to get into position for the Battle of Towton, then it was a very important action. If the Lancastrians were already in position, then it might not have had the same kind of strategic or operational importance. We just don't know. But either way, this video has hopefully helped to show that even scene-setting skirmishes can be interesting, and that medieval warfare could be very sophisticated and, to some extent, very modern. It's not difficult to imagine this kind of battle and the light cavalry interactions surrounding it taking place in almost any period. So, hope you all enjoyed this episode of The War Room. If you'd like to see these videos early and support the channel, you can do so on Patreon or via YouTube memberships, whether you do or not. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.